Welcome to A State of Mind, the podcast that brings together consciousness, meditation, mindfulness, psychology, psychedelics, and so much more in pursuit of this mystery we call life. This is Julian Royce. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm really excited to share this conversation with all of you. I think it really captures a lot of what this podcast is all about. And if you are enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting us. We have a Patreon account, patreon.com/astateofmind. And I have a new website for the podcast that I will be launching soon. And we have an update of the logo, as well as some t-shirts, stickers, things like that you can get with it. If you're watching the YouTube video, you can see some examples of those on the video. So today I'm speaking with Sashi Gerzon-Rose. Sashi is a fellow therapist, and she actually helped me come up with the title for this conversation, which is Consciousness is the Glue, Psychedelics, Couples Work, and Buddhism. And it was just such a treat and pleasure to talk with her. We got quite deep, we cover a lot of ground. This was a rich, fulfilling conversation, one that I learned from, and I hope you do as well. Without further ado, I bring you Sashi Gerzon-Rose. I'm here today with Sashi Gerzon-Rose. Sashi, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And you are also a therapist in the area. Mm-hmm. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and talk about what you do? Sure,
yeah. So I work primarily with individuals and couples. I also offer psychedelic therapy, specifically ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and psychedelic integration. And I'm also actually starting a meditation group.
Oh, cool.
Too. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
A lot of offerings.
Yeah.
And then something I often ask guests that I get to talk with here is just a little bit about your life and how you came to be doing the work you're doing. Did it feel like a calling for you?
Yeah. Well, I think, both having parents with unprocessed trauma, like many of us in the field, right? So some sort of unasked for initiation into this role of a helper or a caregiver, or in moments being actually the parentified child, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then to kind of presence the positives as well. Both my parents were actually incredibly spiritual in very different ways. And so I think the cultivation of this rich spiritual life from a really early age just helped shape and support the cultivation of that within me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mind, what kind of spirituality did you grow up with?
So, my mom was just your kind of run-of-the-mill Buddhist Jew, and very liberal and progressive.
It's interesting that we have a word for that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then my dad, actually, they got divorced when I was 3. My dad remarried pretty quickly to an Israeli Orthodox woman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he became Orthodox, Jewish Orthodox. And so pretty quickly, my world became at least half, because it was half custody, kind of steeped in this Jewish Orthodox religion. So a lot of intensity. I'm trying to think about how to say this in a way that doesn't sound totally negative, because I think that there's definitely, as in all conventional religions, a lot of morality in the sense that this is good, this is bad.
Right.
A lot of emphasis on you're a girl.
Oh, interesting.
Girls do very different things than boys.
The Orthodox is very, I guess I don't know a ton about it, but quite steeped in those things you're talking about, like separation between the sexes.
Yes, absolutely.
Traditional roles.
Yeah, so women have to dress modestly.
Okay, yeah.
There's this emphasis, even though it's a very sex-positive culture, actually, there's also a lot of emphasis on modesty and not kind of... I guess exciting a man, right? So cover your body so that men don't get
and that, of course, was
too
true
excited.
in Christianity, generally speaking, a few hundred years ago, too.
Right,
Islam
yes. So it's a culture that's really rooted, that's really preserved the past in a way. Right. And so there's the negative with that in terms of just these really outdated beliefs. But then there's the positive that I really experienced around the ancient concentrated transmission of spirituality that I think really gets lost when we water down religion to fit in and adapt with current culture.
Right.
Yeah.
That's such a big subject.
Yeah, totally.
You can be going on religion and culture, but that...
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you just said the word watered down.
Yeah.
When you said that, to me, it makes me think of kind of preserving the essence, like you're talking about, the good part, and then also the evolution, the adaptation to our own time and cultural mores. And it's interesting, like people might, because we might get into Buddhism a little bit here.
Yeah.
If you go to India or Nepal or wherever, if you go to the East, so-called, traditionally they also have these separations between men and women, and women are supposed to dress modestly, and women are supposed to be accompanied by, generally speaking, family members. I mean, it depends on what part of India, perhaps, and those kinds of norms are changing, but it just seems like this thing between like pre-modern and modern. Totally. It's such a big thing that's like worldwide. It's not just about our culture or about this religion. It applies pretty generally, I think.
Absolutely. And in a way, I think it's this critical question, like you're saying, beyond which particular religion or spiritual practice one might be steeped in, this question of how do we not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Yeah. How do we maintain and preserve and conserve the heart, right? The jewel of what it offers, while also incorporating in this discriminating eye, this critical awareness around innovation and what actually is no longer relevant or helpful. And that, of course, is so subjective. But yeah.
That sounds like you weren't so scarred by that you totally rejected the tradition.
Yeah,
some good from it.
There were some years of that. There were some years of that, but I think I'm able to. I have this memory. I was quite young, and it was a Saturday, so it was a Shabbat, and I was in temple, and I was looking at this like holy book, essentially this Jewish book, and the paper is made out of this kind of thin rice paper, and there's this Hebrew writing with all these prayers, and I have no idea what it says, but I just remember the intense experience of, again, this transmission of the ancient and how powerful that was.
That's beautiful.
It was so beautiful.
Something coming through from the past.
Yes.
Our ancestry and lineage.
So I could be grateful for that and again, receive what's good about it and let go of, what doesn't feel true for me or what doesn't feel helpful.
I think that's so important and worth speaking to, and it's easy to forget. I don't know, it's not easy to forget about, or I think a lot of people today, especially in more modern cultures like America, we don't know what our great grandparents were doing. Like, we've lost touch with this, our lineage, our past, our ancestors in a way that I think pre-modern people would have found unbelievable. Just because it was so important to know where you came from, and we're not rooted in a place and a time and traditions in the same way.
Right.
And in exchange, we have all this freedom, you know.
Right.
And there's good and bad there, but I think the bad side is it can lead to a sense of alienation and being cut off from
absolutely disconnection.
Disconnection, and
yes, which I think is an epidemic of our time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. And I don't really know what the answer is. I think we can consciously reconnect more with that and pay attention to it, and we can take a DNA test and we can talk more with our family. But we're in a new place, is what I'm saying. We're not going to go back.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think the kind of reverent referencing of where we come from, and also a connecting in with where we are now, specifically the natural world, right? Because there's a way in which so I think there's different levels, if you will, of connection. We can be connected to the self. We can be connected to our clan, right?
Yeah.
That which we come from in terms of immediate family, and then even more broadly, whether it's a religion or geography or even nationalism. And then we can expand out even further in terms of including the earth and these beings who are not just human, right? Like dogs and plant life, right? So actually including more in our sense of belonging. Yeah,
I like makes me think like you could almost like flip all this alienation, disconnection, individuality to like more connection of like, which we know we have access to so much more knowledge. Like,
absolutely.
We can study and know and learn all these different cultures and about the earth and about the environment we're in.
And I think
we have access to more.
Absolutely. And I think the trick is, how do we connect that knowledge to our limbic system? And how do we connect that knowledge to this embodied experience? Right? Because we are such limbic creatures, because we are so resonant. And I think that's the, in a way, some of the challenges we're facing with being so connected, technologically speaking, and yet this epidemic of disconnection or loneliness or feeling unmoored. Yeah,
that's a good way to say it. Like, do you want to speak more about this limbic system? Like, I mean, when you say that, I think of like our emotionality, our feeling, or like an embodiment, a somatic piece.
Yeah, totally.
That there's like deeper ways of knowing than just thinking about stuff, right?
Yes. Definitely.
That's probably a big part of the work you do with people.
Yes. Yeah. So one way, I mean, what immediately comes to mind actually is attachment, right? So our, when I'm talking with clients about emotion and, in a way, the function of emotion, I'll start with that the simple fact that we are wired to connect. I mean, so reptiles eat their babies. Mammals do not, right? Mammals actually need to care for their young for the survival of our species, and particularly humans. Our babies.
We're kind of extreme in that way.
We're super extreme. I think a horse can stand within like 4 hours or something.
Oh, wow.
Babies, right? Like, we actually care for our young conventionally up to about 18.
Right. That's a good example with the horse. Like, if a pack of wolves came to the horses in the wild and the baby was a couple weeks old, it would be able to
run.
It might be weaker and slower, but it could at least walk on its own.
Yes.
Whereas a human obviously can't.
Right.
We gotta be on mama's back or something.
Right. So our attachment system, and specifically our love for each other, is actually what allows for our species to survive.
Yeah. And that's a big part of what therapy can provide, right? Like this learning how to be in deeper relationship, learning how to navigate our own attachment system. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question because, again, I think it's helpful to reference the past in that therapy, at least as far as I'm aware, evolved or was conceived to deal with mental illness, right? To help alleviate suffering.
That's a good point.
To help people overcome unhealthy mental patterns that are getting in the way of, on the more extreme end, being in touch with reality, right? Or I should say consensus reality.
Nice, yeah.
Right? I think we're all, many of us on this path, so to speak, are working towards seeing reality as it is.
Like in a deeper way than that.
Yeah. But
to be able to appreciate and respect consensus reality, I call it conventional reality usually, but I think the word consensus might be more accurate. But like if, people in society generally agree, say something is true or good, then we know that, at least have knowledge of that.
Yeah, we agree that you're not going to kill me, right? Like, you're not going to steal from me. We're going to cooperate. We're going to, if someone's in line ahead of me, I'm not going to yell at them and tell them to get out of my way, right? Like there are these.
There's a lot that we can take for granted. Normal people can take for granted.
Yes.
And I actually have some clients now that are somewhere in the schizophrenic spectrum, and it's like made me appreciate so much like how delicate this stuff is.
Yeah.
And how easily it can, I don't know, for some people it's not there in the same way.
Right, absolutely.
Like, for example, like the sense of everyone is, like that show, The Truman Show. Like some people are living their lives believing actually that they're in a kind of Truman Show and that everyone is conspiring behind the scenes, and if they see someone on the sidewalk, that person was planted there. If they turn on the radio, that's a message for them, like that kind of like, and they're not able to navigate in the world because of that. Right. And just what comes to mind for me hearing that is just the amount of suffering. It causes a lot of suffering, yeah.
So, conventionally, I think therapy is this offering, or perhaps the structure, again, conventionally, where folks who are suffering come to, a trusted expert, a trusted guide in the realm of the psyche, and through working together, through diligent work, perhaps some of the suffering can be alleviated. There can be a cultivation of more skillful and more relevant ways of operating, whether that's behavior or thought, thinking, or being in relationship with oneself or being in relationship with another.
Right.
And then there's the relational component as well that you were referring to. In that, again, because we are such relational creatures, so much of our wounding occurs in relationship, and so it's in relationship where repair and healing can occur. Right?
That's a good message to share, and I've heard a lot of therapists and people in the psychology world talk about that. Like if you're wounded in relationship, to find that healing in relationship, and every time I hear that, I have a little bit of an asterisk, like because I believe that you couldn't, someone can heal on their own. How do I say this? That healing can happen. It doesn't have to be in a relationship with like another person physically present, because I believe that we're already always in relationship with the world around us.
Absolutely.
And if we wanted to go into the more spiritual direction, which some people might not resonate with or believe in, but that you could even have like a spiritual presence, for example.
Absolutely.
Or a dream, or I don't know, just being in a relationship with your own mind, your own psyche. And so I just want to say that because I imagine someone could feel alienated or alone, and then they feel like they have to be in a relationship, and I just feel like that could add to their sense of being inadequate or not good enough. And
absolutely. I do. So I think I agree with what you're saying, and I certainly can see examples where doing the work with another might not be needed for some people. And then I think for others, it's absolutely needed.
It isn't, yeah. It's a both and, like it's...
Yeah.
Like if you, however you heal or do this kind of work we're talking about, then you'll be more available for relationships, so it can happen more naturally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There is, I'm trying to think about where I heard this quote, but there is a quote, I don't know the reference, that said, like the next Buddha will be the Sangha.
Yeah, I know that quote. I think it's attributed to Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay.
Or I've seen it that way. And
yeah.
It's a beautiful saying that the
Yeah.
Sangha being like a community, right? A group,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
rather than
But again,
individual.
in relationship.
In relationship, yeah. It does seem like we need more of that, like loving community, obviously.
Right.
Would be great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess there's this question that's come up in my mind and on the podcast some, and it's, if we get into the territory of Buddhism and meditation, generally speaking, that's an activity that people do on their own. And yet, Sangha is the Buddhist word for community, that is an important role to play, perhaps the most important, or one of the most important. And then I've heard some people criticize spiritual practice and meditation, and people get really into yoga, that they're learning ways to regulate themselves on their own, rather than in community or in connection with another human. And again, I think it could be a both and, like they should be able to supporting each other, but
Absolutely.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. That
Yeah.
because when we, when I think about myself, like when I was a young, like 20, 21, I got so into meditation and so inspired by that, and I had the idea that to be this advanced meditator and to become a Buddha or whatever I wanted, enlightened, all this stuff, I had to go on my own and sit in a cave, whatever.
Yeah, the kind of classical path of the
Yeah,
Buddha,
yeah,
right? Which is I'm
literally
going
what
to
the
leave
Buddha
my
did.
family.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave my family. I'm going to go out. I'm going to sit under a tree by myself
Right.
until I am enlightened.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that can cause issues for people. I think in my own life it led me to for a number of years not being as invested in friendships and relationships and community,
Right.
and even my family. And now that I'm older, I really value those, and I put time and energy into them, and
Yeah.
it's very worthwhile. And I don't see a contradiction there in the way that I used to in the past. So.
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts that come to mind. The first is, this is one of the things that I really love about Zen. What I've studied in Zen is there's this emphasis not only on realization, right? The experience of encountering the enlightenment, encountering open, vast, unbound awareness, the recognition that I am that, but actually just as important is manifestation, right? So actually, and going back to these various paths in Buddhism, right? Hinayana was more of that classic taking refuge from the world or from desires. And then the Mahayana path is practicing in the marketplace. Okay, shit. Can I curse?
Yeah, you can
curse. Oh God, right? It's I got really good at regulating myself. Now I have to deal with you, and you really irritate me, right?
Yeah.
It's just we irritate each other. We rub up against each other.
Yeah.
In relationship, and we cannot have intimacy without that, actually. And so that skill, that learning how to be in relationship, how to deal with each other, how to work with each other, how to how to live a good life that actually includes not just myself, but and not just my family or the people that I love, but actually the people that are hard for me. Because if we don't work together,
right.
We're not working together, and things aren't going very well on from a global perspective, and a planetary perspective.
That's a good point.
So I think that process of learning how to work together well, be good to each other, is really, really important. And
super important.
And in the work that I do with couples, a lot of the emphasis is on what's called co-regulation.
Right.
Which, it's not the same as external regulation, which is what a parent does for a child. Before that child has developmentally learned to regulate themselves. But actually in co-regulation, there's this deep recognition of interdependence, right? I'm actually living in a fantasy if I'm trying to uphold this belief that I can get away with shit and like not get the natural consequences of that, right? Or that I can not be impacted by you.
That's a good one. Yeah, like living. I mean, obviously, if you live with someone in a relationship, it kind of forces you to realize that more.
Right. Absolutely.
I realized we kind of went a little far afield, but I appreciate it. But like, just for people listening, like the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, it's like kind of the historical development of Buddhism, different types of Buddhism. And there's different ways you could talk about that, but it really struck me, like what we were talking about with the individual meditator versus connecting in community. It really parallels that historical development. So I imagine, people were literally having similar conversation 2,000 years ago, probably.
Yeah.
Because, so it's just interesting to note that.
And it's still relevant.
And it's still so relevant,
Yeah.
But yeah, so in your work with couples, this idea of co-regulation, do we want to like say a little bit, like this is a big question, like regulation, that word gets used a lot. It's really struck me recently how profound that concept is, or the process it refers to.
Yeah.
Like how do you speak about regulation?
Yeah. Well, what first comes to mind is that perhaps it might be helpful to define dysregulation. Yeah. And I think it is a very broad topic. What feels important to note to me is that I would say, I think there can be kind of little dysregulation where we are, right, so we have our window of tolerance, where the bottom half of the window, for those of you who are listening, I'm holding up my hands, creating a kind of space in between my bottom hand and my top. And the bottom of the window is what we call hypoarousal. And that's related to depression.
Low energy, right?
Low energy, exactly. And on an extreme, right? So that might mean getting a little sleepy or lethargic. You're in a really boring setting. You start to nod off. You check out. So it doesn't have to be pathological. It's totally normal. Happens to all of us. On the more extreme end, it can be things like fainting.
Like a total shutdown.
A total shutdown. Yeah. A total shutdown. Yeah. Dissociation. Right? So a real just checking out. And then the upper end of the window is what we call hyperarousal. And this can look like anxiety, even a lot of excitement, right? And then more extremely, it can be getting into fight or flight, and even freeze sometimes. The freeze that, for example, a rabbit does when I'm walking my dog, and my dog who has a high prey drive, she's actually going into hyperarousal, right? She goes into hunt mode, and the rabbit freezes, but it's not like a total dissociative freeze where the rabbit actually starts to shut down because its body is sensing that death is imminent.
That's a good example.
It's a temporary freeze until the dog, right, or the threat
is... It's kind of rigid, right?
It's rigid, totally. So its heart is pumping really fast. There's all this anxiety on the inside, but the body is frozen until the threat has passed, and then it can shake it out and continue on its way. Anyway, dysregulation, I would say, is when we reach the upper end or the lower end of the window. and then the ability to regulate is to bring ourselves back in to that window of tolerance where we're able, I think, to take deep breaths and slow ourselves down and come back to a more balanced state.
Yeah, and hopefully feel like ourselves there.
Totally.
And have choice. And
have
see
choice.
Things more clearly. And
absolutely.
Take different perspectives. And,
absolutely, yeah. Have access to the prefrontal cortex,
right,
which is the adult brain. Yeah.
And so in couples therapy, you're helping people to do that with each other. That if in the realm of the relationship and emotions.
Yes, and it's very practical, right? So, so it might be something like, for example, with my husband, one of the ways he does it is if I'm getting irritated and I have maybe like a sharp tone, one of the things he'll say to me is he'll just look at me and smile and he'll say, "Do you want to fight?" And it's just this awesome, like, it's humorous, it's friendly. Yeah, it's like, whoa, there's no problem here, right? So, and that just almost always relaxes me, calms me down. I'm able to access humor. So that's just.
I think the tone of voice is a good one to mention because especially for whatever reason, when you're in a relationship for a long enough time with someone, like a little tone of voice that no one else would notice, and then all of a sudden you are.
All the little things. We're tracking each other all the time. We're tracking each other all the time.
Yeah.
So it's noticing when our partner gets triggered, to use a very therapeutic word, and noticing when our partner responds to us essentially as threat, and to have the grace and the regulation ourselves, the resource ourselves, to be friendly, right? To lean in, to be kind, to use a soothing voice, to maintain eye contact, right? I'm like communicating to you. I'm on your side.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting that you said like see your partner as a threat. That can happen where the person that we normally, most of the time, say we love and care about, all of a sudden they can perceive them as someone to get rid of or run away from.
Absolutely. Someone who is fundamentally not on our side. Someone who is fundamentally not on our team.
Yeah.
And it's that perception that I think leads to so many of the problems couples come in for, right? Like, we need better communication.
Right, that's what everyone's going to say, right? Totally,
yeah. And it's true. It's not that it's not true. It's just that the communication, it's I think it's a both and, again, in terms of, yes, we can develop helpful external behaviors, and we can get more skillful at asking for what we need or expressing something that doesn't work for us.
Right.
Or communicating anger or sadness or fear, whatever it is. And the skills alone are not enough, because when we are in that moment of dysregulation or trigger, if we do not have this fundamental experience of we're on the same team, we will perceive the person across from us as a threat, and so we will react accordingly.
Yeah, that being on the same team, I mean, that's what you want, that's what people... That's interesting. I mean, in a particular moment in time, you could actually not be on the same team, right? So that could actually be an accurate perception.
Yeah.
Like in the bigger perspective, if you're married, hopefully you are on the same team and care about each other.
Right. Well, and so I think perhaps then it's like, well, what does it mean to be on the same team? You know, does it mean that you have the same perspective all the time? No. Does it mean that you don't see things differently sometimes? Absolutely not. Diversity is a gift, actually, right?
Yeah.
It's helpful when we can include different perspectives
Yeah.
I suck at math. My husband's great at it. I'm so glad that I have someone. Yeah, absolutely. And when we are kind of polarized in our differences is when difference starts to feel, again, like a threat.
Yeah. Well, in the example you gave, like your husband saying to you, do you want to fight? That's like this surprising kind of counterintuitive thing, but it like flips it where it's like, oh, we can fight together and be on the same team and like consciously do that.
Totally.
But I imagine for him to do that, he needs to be regulated in a good place. And if
absolutely.
both of you are dysregulated and both of you are kind of triggered, that's when that becomes...
That's when it's hard.
Yeah, that's when
absolutely.
It's hard.
Yeah. And I think, I think it's important, it feels important for me to name that a good relationship, a healthy relationship is not without anger. And it's not without fighting.
Well, you can include that.
Absolutely. I think we have to include it.
Yeah.
Otherwise it gets pushed into the shadows and it comes out in super weird ways.
Right.
I think it's actually cultivating a trust that we can fight well. We can fight safely. If we fight, we will get through it. We will find our way to the other side, which is intimacy, which is deeper understanding, right? Which is a greater sense of coherence, actually. But we have to get through the scuffle to get there.
That's, there's so much in that, what you're saying, like that you include anger, even include fighting.
Yeah.
Make it more, what is the word, conscious or productive even?
Absolutely. Yeah. I call it generative conflict, right?
Okay.
Is this generative conflict or is it not, right?
Right. Like is it leading to a good result or is it kind of just trying to tear the other person down? And,
right. Destructive.
Destructive, right.
Yeah. Or just a stalemate, right?
Stalemate, yeah.
We're just, oh God. And this is actually something that I think can be so painful, is when couples have the experience like, oh God, we're having this fight again, right?
We're stuck here.
We're stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so sometimes what's needed is, again, going back to this idea of regulation, can we hang out in the stuckness together? Can we, which requires a lot of self-regulation, a lot of frustration tolerance. This is so painful. I feel so divided from you.
To tolerate the discomfort of that and stay
absolutely.
there. And,
yeah.
And I appreciate what you just said, that it requires a lot of self-regulation. So like if meditation, for example, mindfulness is a way to self-regulate, then those skills are so valuable in a relationship. Then,
absolutely. Right. I'm going to breathe, I'm gonna witness, I'm gonna experience the intensity of my fear or my sadness or my anger, my frustration arising. And I'm gonna breathe and I'm going to take care of myself, and then I'm going to soothe myself so that I can stay, so that I don't have to leave or check out or shut the thing down by blaming you or collapsing into shame or whatever it is. Yeah. Right? I'm going to stay available so that we can hang out in the unknown together, hopefully find a creative solution. Yeah. And then sometimes the creative solution occurs through so many moments of just being compassionate with ourselves and with each other in the pain of like, oh God, here we are again.
I could feel familiar, and that can make it more painful, obviously. And
yes.
I was going to say that impulse to destruction, the destructive kind of fighting, can also be turned on oneself.
Totally.
And we see that with depression, but
self-harm.
and that can be a tough one. But to be able to recognize that if you are being really hard on yourself or kind of being destructive to yourself, that's actually, obviously it's not good. But to be able to like recognize it and to have choice there and like get out of that pattern and
absolutely.
Like, the right kind of relationship could really help you to see that and come over it. But it's a tricky one because it can, if you're isolating yourself and doing that, it's going to be hard to work with.
Right, absolutely.
Really tough,
yeah, I had this, he wasn't a therapist, he was a healer, the most intense human being I've ever met in my life. Okay.
That's really saying something.
without going too far in depth with what he did, but he essentially saw the energetic body. And so he saw emotions. And he described himself as kind of a mechanic of emotions. So one of the processes he offered to his clients was that of what he called emotional release. And he described the importance of being in right relationship with anger, actually, because naturally it is explosive. Naturally, the wisdom of anger, right, is clarity, that it sets a boundary. You've crossed my boundary.
Right.
There's some injustice here. Something is off. When, for whatever reason, an individual develops a coping mechanism where they actually have to turn that anger on themselves, either because it's not safe to get mad at...
It's interesting. We put it as a coping mechanism.
It's a coping mechanism, absolutely, right? So it's like it becomes implosive. It has to go somewhere. It implodes. The way of working with that, actually, this practitioner said, at least, and I happen to agree with him, was to externalize it again in a constructive way.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so whether that's going for a run, I mean, we know that with anger, adrenaline, cortisol gets released, so big muscle movements. He talked about, I'm not advising this, but he talked about chopping down a dead tree. So you're actually using this destructive energy for good. Right? You're not chopping down... Yeah, you make firewood. You're not chopping down a live tree. You're actually helping the earth. So anyway.
No, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So he just started being able to see, like, the way we see things with our eyes.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he was usually pretty spot on.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. I think there is a physiological component to our emotions, and so it's not just in the realm of, I don't know, imagination or something. Obviously, it's these things are alive in us. They're energies, they're forces.
And again, they are just as important to our survival as our organs. Right? Again, going back
That's
to
a great point.
Love.
There's a reason.
Yeah. Right? We love so deeply because we would not survive without it. We have actually disgust is a primary emotion because if you think about it on a physiological level, it's very intelligent to be disgusted by rotting food. Right? So we have these aversion.
Or a cockroach, maybe.
Right. Or even a strange person from a different tribe who might pose as a threat. I mean, that's kind of the origin of xenophobia.
Right, that there's
That back in the day, strangers were more dangerous to us.
That's when we can, like, learn to overcome in ourselves.
Yes.
And open up to.
Right, so there's wisdom or intelligence in every emotion. Doesn't mean the raw message is necessarily the one to to follow.
I love that. You just said that really well, but it's something that we've talked about on the podcast, but to honor emotions and our thoughts, and there's wisdom there, but it doesn't mean to just blindly follow the impulse of when it's there. And I think, hopefully, maybe it's just a phase some people go through, but that certain, spiritual teachings or, I feel like I see kind of like coaching people kind of do this, where it's like really getting people to like follow their truth. Okay, great, you're following your truth, but then if you just end up being this like kind of impulsive, narcissistic, selfish, self-absorbed person, like that's kind of a shadow side of some of that.
Right, and what does that even mean, follow your truth, right? I think there can be truth in the moment.
Right.
And then perhaps a higher truth or some sort of integrity that's actually more trustable. Anchor
in something bigger than that momentary impulse.
Right.
Yeah, that's
which is a lot of the work that I do with couples as well. Because I'm actually trained in a couple different models. The model that I'm most steeped in these days and I suppose find to be most helpful, most potent is PACT, the psychobiological approach to couples therapy.
Awesome. That's Stan Tatkin.
Stan Tatkin. And he's big on establishing agreements.
Oh.
And one of the things he says is that, you know, we often go into a business partnership or deciding what school we're going to go to or what outfit we're going to wear for the day, actually with more discernment and more thought than the people that we end up with, right? Like there's something that is so primal about choosing a mate, and that's not to be ignored or discounted, and it's pretty problematic to sign on for long-term relationship with someone or a life with someone when you don't even know if your values align, if you don't even know if you have like, are we going in the same direction? Right.
This is such an important point you're bringing up, and that was on my list of things to ask you about, which I think relates, is when you're working with a couple, or it could just be an individual, but that's in a relationship, like, how do you, is there a time and a place where you would actually question the relationship versus supporting the relationship? Like, where you might think that the best thing for them would be to leave the relationship, and how do you navigate that or know that? Because that's it seems like such a big thing, like the people we spend time with obviously are so important. And
so I'd say the kind of bright line around where I bring my my judgment in as a clinician, or my opinion in as a clinician, or perhaps explicit guidance in as a clinician, is when it's an abusive relationship. So if there is a clear power differential, someone is being controlling or abusive or manipulative, couples therapy is not indicated, and it's just
so you refuse to see them.
I can't. Couples therapist. It's not ethical actually to try to establish trust in a fundamentally untrustable situation, right? I'm not going to try and get someone to be vulnerable with someone who's abusing them. So that's kind of a bright line.
That's a little bit different than advising that person to leave their relationship.
Exactly. So I don't advise people what to do.
Okay.
I try to help them get really clear about what's true for them, right? But from a really trustable place.
A deeper place, and make their own choice, of course. That makes sense. Just seems like a big thing and a tricky thing, like if a relationship is really rocky and even have abusive dynamics, to do the work to try to fix it, or to get on your lifeboat and get out of there. I don't know. But then, so that's one way to talk about it. But another way to ask a similar question is like, what you're talking to is like, if you are, maybe you're not in a relationship, or you're not in a very deep relationship, to like really think about what kind of partner you want, what kind of agreements you want, what kind of life you want to have, like to make that more conscious.
Absolutely.
And then look for that thing, right? Rather than just fall into or kind of follow the... I mean, there's something to be said for chemistry, like people feel attracted to each other.
Yes.
I mean, there's so much here.
Although sometimes we're really attracted to what's not very good for us.
Right.
And, right? And so...
This is kind of the stuff that so much drama and TV shows and movies and novels and our lives get consumed by. I mean, we're not always attracted to the people that are good for us.
Right. I really like the metaphor of food. Like, I really like, a friend's dad once said, if it starts with fireworks, it's probably going to end with fireworks, and versus like a slow burn, like a slow sustainable burn. But with food, I think about kind of the immediate dopamine hit and rush of, like fries and cake and like all this really delicious kind of addicting foods. That
Right, that we know aren't good for us, but we love them. And
right.
Yeah.
Or that perhaps for whatever reason, there's a kind of a crash afterwards, right? There's a crash, versus like a very wholesome.
That's a good way to look at it, yeah.
Meal that can be delicious. It might not trigger the same kind of instant salivating.
Instant gratification.
Gratification.
But 2 hours later, you feel better.
You feel great, and and it's sustainable.
It's a good metaphor.
A lot, Some of the work that I do with individuals actually are people who are coming because they're sick of choosing unhealthy partners again and again and again, and they're ready to actually do something differently. Yeah. So there's a lot of work around, again, visioning, like, well, what are the qualities that you want, and what's negotiable, what's non-negotiable.
Right.
And then, of course, the hard work is, again, manifestation.
Like bringing it into practice. And
totally.
Probably not being too rigid or perfectionistic about it either.
Absolutely.
Another trap, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, imagine if a couple came to you and it was an abusive dynamic to the point where you said, I'm not going to work with you guys. Hopefully that would be a kind of wake-up call and actually help them to, or help one of them to see things more clearly.
Absolutely.
And I had that experience kind of for the first time. It was for the first time about a month ago.
With a couple?
Yeah, and it was pretty extreme. And it was the guy yelling at his partner, and then I had to stop, kind of like, let's slow down, let's stop, like let's, and then try to establish some ground rules of listening and reflecting back what the other person is saying and giving space. And then they came back in for round 2 and it was the exact same thing. And then I had to tell them I couldn't see them anymore. But it was so painful and so difficult. And like my dog was here and I got scared and like ran into a corner and like I don't want to, but the guy just, it was very hard for him he didn't seem to be aware at all of how he was showing up and how he was being perceived, and even the fact that he was raising his voice, which objectively was true. I don't think in his subjective experience he was able to realize what he was doing. So it was amazing to witness it, and I felt sad I couldn't help more. But there was no room really to get in. It was like hitting a brick wall. Yeah. And I don't think he wanted to be that way. I think there was a lot of trauma from his past.
Of course.
And I think he grew up in an abusive household. So
what comes to mind for me hearing that story is, if it was workable, that felt workable in the moment, to actually, it's a great example of impact. Right? Do you realize, sir, that when you raise your voice, the dog is cowering in the corner?
Right, yeah.
Are you aware that you have that impact?
Yeah.
How do you think it is for her when you raise your voice that way? Yeah,
and that some version of that got said a couple times, but it didn't really land. But and then it just went back to the same thing.
Yes. Well, and so again, what we know in terms of the efficacy of therapy or counseling, and I would say coaching as well, is the number one factor is a client's readiness to change, right? The kind of ripeness to transform, to do the work, to adjust.
In this case, he didn't have that openness or attitude even.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. So
I
don't work a lot with couples. I've had a few experiences. But it's a rich and it's a challenging territory to work in, so I salute you.
It's very dynamic. It keeps me on the edge of my seat. I think I love the element. I think I really love the dynamism of it. I love the really often being on the edge of what I know and what I don't know. So I feel trustable enough in my foundation as a clinician to explore the complexity with clients.
Yeah, it's challenging. Yeah, a lot so complex.
So
just
complex.
One person is their own universe, but
Yes,
couples. So
exactly.
really had 3 universes there, right?
Yeah.
Each individual and then the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but part of my question is coming from when you establish a relationship with someone, it does take on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why people stay in relationships that are abusive or aren't the best. And it can be really hard to envision a different future for yourself, to take the courage to step out of that. I mean, that's an extreme example, but it happens where someone is in an abusive relationship and it goes on for years and years, and then everyone else is like, why are they still in that relationship?
And it doesn't even have to be abusive, right? It could simply be a relationship that's just not vital, right? Like a relationship that's actually not for the best of both people.
Right. But it's so hard to see that.
It's so hard to leave. And again, that goes back to attachment. We are wired to attach.
We have these attachment systems and they sync up, and then before you know it, it's,
and the fear of the unknown, and the fear of, oh God, do I have to date again? And how am I going to find, right? The fear of the unknown. Maybe what I know is better than what I don't know.
There's that. I think there's also a quality of loyalty that some people have more or less of, and that has its pros and cons. And
absolutely.
Because what are you being loyal to? It's a good question to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Right. Is it the comfort of familiarity? Is it because you actually love this person and you believe in this person and you believe in this relationship? And yeah, it's a great question.
It's interesting for me to think about on a planet with 7 billion people. Why is it so hard to you would think that in a pretty free society like ours, it would be easier for people to meet and to navigate and to what do I want in a partner in life, but maybe for some people it is easy, but it seems like for a lot of us it is very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is that a couple things. The first is something that Stan will often say is that our agreements are so important because as human beings we are very fickle and we're very difficult, He said this thing that when, he wishes that when couples were taking their vows, that they would vow to take each other on as their burden. Right?
Oh, wow.
So,
that is almost like Christian undertone, like the burden of the cross, carrying your weight in the world.
Right.
But to see it more as a challenge, or to know that it will be challenging rather than...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I saw you have Bruce Tift's book. I saw him personally when I first moved to Boulder, and one of the things he said to me was, Sashi, why don't you expect for a relationship to be inherently disturbing? Right? This this inclusion of the difficulty of being with other humans and the difficulty. I've been married now for about 5-ish years now. No, 4 years. And together for 6, and it's my longest relationship. And
well, congratulations.
Thanks. and it, there's this sometimes it just feels relentless. It's you don't really get to escape very much.
I imagine some people listening will love to hear that coming from you, since you work as a therapist and couples therapist, and it's also as challenging thing.
Well,
some
and
I was gonna say, sorry, just in my list of questions you before we met was how the Disney fairy tale story of romance is such a disservice to us, because we grow up thinking that we'll get married and live happily ever after. Versus what you're talking about is a more realistic, more helpful, more honest, more true, and ultimately I think more rewarding.
Yes.
Because it honors our humanity, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that I feel like I do for my clients is I normalize the challenge of life.
Nice, yeah.
That life is often very hard. Like, where did we get this story? I mean, I think this is a product of modernity and Western culture, that life should be easy, that we should know the way to do it, right? Our ancestors, at least my ancestors, were like probably digging up potatoes back in Russia. You know, I mean, life was not expected.
Labor.
Yeah, life was not expected to be this fulfillment of my happiness. And it's a gift of our time that we have the privilege to pursue happiness. Yeah. We have the privilege to pursue optimal living as opposed to just survival.
Right.
But I think it's really, really important. I think a lot of our suffering actually comes from the belief that it shouldn't be hard, that we shouldn't be sad, that we shouldn't be scared, that we shouldn't be anxious, that we shouldn't be uncertain. And so the same is true for coupledom, right? In the sense that, yes, we want to be with someone that we like fundamentally, right? Like, I'm going to spend a lot of time with you. I want to laugh with you. I want to enjoy you. I want to be aligned with what you're aligned with to a certain degree. And this is what I was going to say, and I got a little sidetracked. Because we are fickle human beings, our values or our principles are actually there when we don't want to be nice to each other, when we don't want to be loyal, when we don't want to do the right thing, so to speak. Right?
Yeah, it's like a protection or a scaffolding of what we actually stand for.
Absolutely. And in the moments where we're really mad at each other, to come back to that recognition of interdependence. Like, okay, if I'm an asshole to you, you're going to be an asshole to me back, probably. Right? So that's like a very kind of practical, in the moment reflection of impact and interconnectedness. And then perhaps, and again, going back to the gift of meditation or mindfulness or metacognition, I can remind myself, I can witness my thoughts.
I see where you're at.
I can witness, wow, I'm really mad. In this moment, I want to say the rude, mean thing because it feels really good in the moment. And I know that in the future, it'll be for the best. Like, it'll be good for me, it'll be good for the relationship, and it'll be good for my partner if I actually take a deep breath and I don't say the really, like, the thing that I know would just cut you down.
That's good. I mean, that's a skill we can develop. And
absolutely.
A maturity, and it's worth doing. And
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that was, there's so much, obviously there's so much here. I just think, I guess part of my point is just that I think as a culture, there's a lot of pressure actually to stay in a relationship. And I wonder, I think that affects people more than we think consciously, and that I kind of would prefer to contribute to creating a culture where it's, appreciate what you have and your time together, and if it's ended, like, to be able to move on. And if you've taken the step of marriage, like, super honor that and work for it for a lifetime. But but even to make that more conscious, like, that we have different levels of relationship that we consciously enter into, and to be okay with that and not shame people or.
Absolutely. I heard this saying once, and I love it. Sometimes you have to break up to wake up. Right? So sometimes actually ending, and sometimes ending the relationship is the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself, for the other.
And sometimes the opposite is true, like really diving in and committing and doing the work together to make it what it could be.
Yes.
And honor each other. So it's like a both and, but
absolutely.
There's a lot of I think a lot of it's kind of under the surface pressure to stay together, to get married, to have kids. All that stuff is still so alive in us, even though we think we are
Yes.
kind of more advanced postmodern people who
Yes.
were so affected by all that stuff, right? It's
Yes.
unbelievable.
And so I think part of the process of individuation is that actually starting to really question these beliefs that we inherited.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether that's from family or culture, the media, whatever. To just, again, to digest, to metabolize what works, right? To not throw the baby out with the bathwater again, to hold on to what feels sacred and true and life-giving, and to relinquish, to let go of the beliefs or practices or expectations that just feel kind of outdated and harmful, not relevant.
Yeah.
And I think that can be applied across the board, whether that's relationship or expectation of self or definition of success or relating to diversity or gender, right? Like all these different ways that as a culture we're starting to question these beliefs that we just thought to be so for a long time.
Diversity is a big one, obviously, and I appreciate you bringing in that there's like an evolutionary reason why we might be distrustful to people that look and sound different than us. And I think this is another big topic, but I think to honor that could actually help us make progress collectively because rather than just, oh, that's terrible, we shouldn't feel that way at all, to actually acknowledge that sometimes you do feel that way and you can work through it consciously and come to a deeper understanding. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, difference, when something is different from an evolutionary perspective, there was a time when it was good to relate to that as a threat. In terms of, hey, your people might bring a novel virus, right, to my tribe. Really is a threat. Yeah, right. And again, just like we were saying with emotion, that just because there's an impulse doesn't mean that it's true, or it doesn't mean that it has to be acted upon. It doesn't mean that it's the highest truth.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, but I agree. Well, throw a little bit of a left turn at you, or us, both of us, but just, we were joking before we started recording about, we were talking about psychedelics and therapy, but we were joking that like for example, for me, the podcast episodes that mention that tend to get more listens and views, and people are excited about it, and so I just aware of our time and wanted to give you space to speak to that. Because you told me you work with ketamine.
I work with ketamine, and I also support people in psychedelic integration. So if they have their own psychedelic experience, I'm happy to support them in integrating that and actually, again, implementing what was so powerful or helpful for them in everyday life.
It's so valuable.
Yeah, and one of the ways that I relate to psychedelic work is in a way not totally different than the way that I relate to spirituality, in the sense that it's or I should say maybe an expansive state, right? So a moment in practice, in meditation, or maybe it's just spontaneous. You're outside, you feel the unity of all things, you see the birds fly across the sky and the wind blow through the trees, and all of a sudden you have this direct experience of interconnection and not being separate,
That's the good side of it, that it can open up that for someone.
Yeah, and actually with psychedelics, what's happening in the brain is very similar to what's happening for long-term meditators.
That's a cool thing to share,
In that the default mode network goes offline. So the default mode network being the part of the brain that is exactly what it sounds like. It's the part of the brain that is ruminative, kind of on autopilot, jumping from the future to the past. This is the piece that I find super interesting. It's also where self-referential thought lives.
Nice, yeah.
So,
which is unfortunately the life experience for much of the time of most of us, right?
Right.
And it's unnecessary, in my opinion. And meditation can help you to see that. You don't have to go through life constantly having this narration of like you're in a movie or something.
Right, and also...
or rehashing the past or whatever.
Right, and also that our story of self is habitual.
Yeah, we're just constantly telling it to ourselves, right?
Right, exactly. and there's wisdom to it in the sense that we need a story of who we are, right? Having a sense of self is a developmental feat. And, right, there's the saying in transpersonal psychology, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. And when we're stuck in the constant reinforcement of self, right, like, am I liked? Am I valued? Did I do a good enough job? Are we okay? I'm good, or I'm a bad person, right? Sometimes it's like this negative construct of self.
Totally, yeah. That's obviously painful. And
it's super painful.
I've been there, and I know a lot of people are stuck there, and
it causes so much suffering.
We have an epidemic in our society of negative self-worth.
Yes,
it's unbelievable.
Exactly.
It's massive.
Yes. So both psychedelics and meditation help that part of the brain go dark so that we can access present moment awareness. Right? And present moment awareness, like just this direct experience of life as opposed to thinking about our lives, thinking our way through life. It's like actually in this moment, I'm a lot freer than my story of who I am. There's a lot more accessible to me. I can access so much more, right? In this moment.
Right. It's available right now if you can tune into it.
Yes.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Just because I was just reading this collection of essays by Mark Epstein.
Oh, yeah.
And he talks about that. You have to be someone before you can be no one.
Yeah.
And I think he knows the guy who first said that. Personally, I can't remember his name right now. But apparently he later kind of went back and like questioned that too. But
Interesting.
I think I don't want to speak for Mark Epstein, but at least from my own point of view, like that if you if you're meditating and you have some insight into self or no self, that could actually lead to greater clarity in which you can have a more coherent story of yourself that's more accurate, that makes more sense, that can drop some of the self-negativity or self-aggrandizement. And so rather than this be somebody before you can be nobody, start meditating now and figure your shit out. I don't know, something like that.
Well, I mean, just to put it practically, what you just said, what I heard in that was like, I can recognize that I am both kind and in some moments rude. Like I can include...
Yeah, both and. Like,
both, I can include more rather than I'm a good person or I'm a bad person.
Right.
And then when I disprove that, I feel a lot of anxiety.
Right.
Because my sense of self is being questioned.
Right.
And so what I do like about the saying, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody, is that like ego is like we need an ego development. Personality disorders are when there actually isn't sufficient egoic development. Right? Yeah. So there is a developmental path.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's true. That's worth saying.
Yeah.
But just that doesn't have to be in contradiction to meditation practice.
Absolutely, yes.
If you're doing it properly, they would support each other.
Totally.
I believe, yeah.
Absolutely.
But there's risk and danger, and there are approaches to yoga or meditation that could take you down a sidetrack, that could maybe...
Yeah.
Disassociation, for example, bypassing, for example.
Totally.
So it's not a cure-all. You have to be intelligent, right?
Yeah.
About how you go about it.
Well, something that my teacher says that I absolutely love is she says that practice, whether it's meditation or yoga or whatever it is, practice is not like taking sandpaper to a piece of wood where you're scrubbing away at it. It's more like taking a cloth and polish to a piece of wood, so you're actually highlighting and supporting its nuances and its uniqueness to shine through. It's so beautiful.
I love that.
Yeah, so in a way, we free ourselves to become more of who we are.
Nice, yeah.
You know, as opposed to being stuck in habitual patterns that, you know, again, at one point were probably adaptive.
Right.
But at this point are getting in the way of that.
That's beautiful. I love that. And before we started recording, you were saying that you've seen some of the ways in which psychedelics can be helpful, and then the areas in which you feel like they can no longer be helpful. And that feels like that's a topic that I've touched on in the podcast, but it's so important, right? That again, they're not going to cure everything or fix everything.
They're not a magic bullet.
Not a magic bullet, and
I think
they deserve a lot of care and respect.
Yes, there's so much excitement about them right now.
Right.
And it's not that that's bad or wrong. I just think the more that I work with them, actually, the more discerning I become in terms of recognizing when and for whom, at least from my subjective perspective, they might be deeply helpful. I mean, I've seen them be transformative.
Wow.
Yeah, for people who are just kind of living in this traumatized state, and then some psychedelic experiences with a lot of integration, with a lot of practices to support, again, integration, have come out transformed on the other side. It's so beautiful.
See, that's so beautiful that you've witnessed that and helped support that. And I think that truth of our own experiences is the force behind this tidal wave that's washing over us, that's driving the legalization. It's like people can't deny that they've had super healing, transformative...
Life-altering.
Yeah.
Life-altering.
So
absolutely.
That's the positive.
And I've also witnessed when then the psychedelic work becomes a crutch or something to lean on or a way to bypass, right? As opposed to, oh God, I feel anxious or I feel depressed again, but let me actually lean into my resilience that I now have, right? Because again, life is not without its hardship.
Right.
And so the question is, when is it the right time? And I like this to be a collaborative decision around, actually, I think, you know, continuing to do this work would actually do more harm than good, or at least it wouldn't.
Like you might challenge someone and
Totally.
a little bit and see what they...
Yeah.
That's good.
What would it
do
be
that
like?
In a compassionate way. And
Absolutely, in a relational way.
you probably need more of that in the psychedelic sphere world in general.
Yeah.
I think right now there's a lot of pumping up all the positives to help this legalization movement or the legitimization of it.
Yes.
And then what we're speaking to is really important, obviously super important, and that's maybe going to become more mainstream in a few years, I hope.
Yeah.
But to be able to check in and is this really helpful? Am I bypassing something? Am I
right? And how do I utilize the amazing experiences that I had to honor those in everyday life, right? So that I don't have to just be on a journey to access my connection with all things. How do I cultivate that relationship without taking something, without altering my psyche in that way?
I think the integration therapy you're talking about is super important and helpful there, and part of that is just honoring these experiences that we've had, like to witness them, to share them, to talk about them in the right supportive environment. Because part of what I see happening is maybe someone has an amazing experience with psychedelics, and then of course there's a natural impulse to want to return there or repeat that, and if you can have a process of really honoring it and remembering it and kind kind of acknowledging it, right? So it's not just some weekend you're at a concert or something.
Absolutely.
I think if that piece is missing, then I think that could drive a more addictive or a grasping attitude after it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I hear in what you're saying is really just bringing a level of consciousness and care to the relationship with it, right?
Yeah, an attitude of not grasping. I think that's a good thing to keep coming back to for myself and people I work with. And we don't have to always that attitude of always wanting more.
Right, and again, we can recognize what's right in grasping, right? That on a fundamental level, we are pleasure-seeking beings, you know? And why wouldn't I want to move towards something that makes me feel so good?
I've got a good one for working with that. It's like, if you're like wanting something more, it's like, if you can kind of relax that and appreciate the moment. I don't know how to put it in the words right now, but I think part of the weird way that we're driven is like, I really want an ice cream, I'm going to go get the ice cream. And there's that desire for it. And then when you get the thing you want, then there's like that satiation. It's actually a stopping. Like the grasping quality is no longer there, and that feels great for a few moments. And that's something that we can access now through mindfulness, through meditation, through ways of regulating ourselves. That to acknowledge that part of the bliss comes from the absence of that grasping.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Yeah. Totally.
And I think that's part of what happens on psychedelics for a lot of people. It's like, you're not consumed with wanting or comparing or...
Because we're not in the default mode network.
Yeah, we're out of the default.
Present moment is enough. Oh my God, the present moment is amazing.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you've seen people, I guess I don't have much personal experience with ketamine at all, but it sounds like you've seen people have experiences like that through ketamine, which I think is always a little surprising to me to hear. And I think for a lot of people, because it's like, what is ketamine? I've never heard of it before, or it has negative connotations of like...
Isn't that the horse tranquilizer?
The horse tranquilizer, yeah.
Yeah.
And so to recognize that it is a psychedelic and it's a legal one, and it can have profound benefit.
Yeah, I think it's the only legal one, technically. I mean, I think cannabis can be psychedelic for sure. Yeah. I
think I did a training with medicinal mindfulness, and they're all about using cannabis as a psychedelic sacrament. And so if you do it in the right way, it absolutely can be. But the way most people habitually use it, I think it's not reaching that potential.
Yeah, cool. I'm curious about that. I would love to hear that at some point. Yeah.
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 It was interesting. I think a big part of what, like the magic of what they were doing, what I experienced with them, was what we're talking about, like taking cannabis and just being with that experience without anything else. And that's actually fairly rare, I think. Usually people will take an edible or smoke, and they will they'll maybe, whatever, clean their house or something, or talk or do homework, or even like
dance.
And that's great. Like dance, or listen to music can be great, but there's something special about 100% of your attention on your own experience and watching yourself go through this shift in consciousness, and not being distracted, not talking, not that's setting that stage, that intention.
And I guess that the discovery and experiencing of consciousness is kind of the magic glue and thread that ties all these various interests and fields and topics of discussion for me together.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether it's Buddhism or therapy or psychedelics.
Yeah.
I feel like consciousness is at the heart of it all.
Yeah, our subjective consciousness experience, our awareness.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. And I mean, in terms of psychedelics, like we know breath work, for example, just altering your breathing intentionally and consciously for a period of time can result in a very psychedelic type experience. And
absolutely, and a shift in consciousness.
Shift in consciousness, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's part of being human to... Yeah. We were talking about our evolutionary drives. I think we have an evolutionary drive to explore those kinds of changes.
Absolutely.
And part of who we are, and however totalitarian and repressive our government is, it's never been able to wipe that out. And I don't think it ever will be. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a great thing.
Absolutely. And shoot, what was I just going to say? The drive towards and not just kind of navel gazing, right? Or I'm just going to trip out and discover consciousness, although I do believe witnessing reality is in and of itself valuable. Right, the recognition, like I am consciousness, recognizing consciousness. I think there's something inherently valuable in that. And
I think so too.
And like going back to couples work or the evolution of working with our emotions, we can also develop these skills and explore these states for the benefit of others, right? What studies have shown is that in general, meditators, and I think this is true for psychedelics as well, I'm not totally sure on that, but I'm pretty sure, is that people tend to be more compassionate. Oh, yeah. Right? People tend to, like, there's just something that happens.
There's been more studies done, to try to look at this scientifically, but I think you're absolutely right. And especially with meditation, that's kind of the whole point, right?
Right.
At least in the forms of Buddhism I come from, it's all about being more compassionate.
If you
meditate for 100 years in a cave and you're still an asshole, there's no point. So
totally.
Don't do that.
Right. So whether it's the recognition of interdependence in my relationship, so I'm just kinder to my partner because I recognize the experience of being intrinsically a part of something bigger naturally brings forth care.
Totally.
Right? So when I recognize, actually when I hurt you, I hurt myself.
That's it. I think psychedelics help people see that. And meditation helps people see that.
Right. Oh, wait, I'm not just a little, separate being moving through my day. Actually, I'm a part of this massive web. And, so there's the experience of connection and then the care that naturally arises from that, I think. And the recognition that, going back to the piece around difference, yes, difference can feel threatening, but it can also, if I can recognize our sameness at the same time, right? If I can feel into the ways, even if we don't believe the same thing, even if we don't look similarly, even if whatever, if I can actually recognize, again, our connection, I can actually appreciate your difference. Totally, I can appreciate the way in which what you bring only makes my life richer.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that, I don't even know what to say now. I guess for me, I'm really excited about these things coming together. Psychology, Buddhism, psychedelics, and that, for example, just like listening to this conversation, like having a compassionate motivation before you go into an experience with psychedelics or meditation. And having that be your guiding star, like the thing that is helping drive you to some degree. And that doesn't answer the question of how you show up in the world and what specifically you'll be doing, but it can be an underlying motivation that I believe is inside all of us and that can be revealed in these ways. And
the motivation to alleviate suffering is also really valid, I think, too, or to experience beauty. I think, and I also trust that at some point, I mean, maybe not, I don't know, but I think at some point the personal can open the door to the transpersonal, when I'm really truly with my own suffering, my own heart can break for the suffering of others, and then it can turn towards that desire to help or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, and it can be a very natural thing.
Yes.
It's part of what I'm getting and talking with you and thinking about these kinds of topics is that to have that experience is wonderful, and then to anchor it and remember it, and that's kind of what I mean by honoring it. Like do you have an insight like that and then to be able to really cultivate it in your life day to day.
Yes, again, going back to the manifestation side of the realization.
Right.
And that's where practices, I'm such a fan of practices. I'll sometimes ask my clients, like, okay, what do you want to practice? Because it can be, a practice can be sitting on the cushion or getting on your mat or whatever it is, but it can also be really spontaneous in the moment. Okay, I notice, again, there's that part of me that feels like my other half of my couple is a worthless piece of shit. Like, right? Like, I can recognize that, and this is a moment where I'm going to practice remembering that we're on the same team.
Right?
And
that can be so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, again, like, I think that the interconnection of perspective and physiology and emotion, we kind of can't relate to them as totally separate because they're all informing each other all the time really quickly.
Well, is there another question I have for you is, I guess, talking about ketamine specifically, that's the legal medicine that you work with in therapy, and people are taking a dose and then being with you, right?
Yep.
Is there anything, if someone calls you up and they're like, they want to do that, like, thing where you would say no to them? Like, what would that look, what would that be? Or do you find that it's mostly helpful for most of the people most of the time?
It's a great question. Again, if people are looking for a magic bullet, right? I hate my life, and which isn't to say that it's not helpful when people are in extreme pain, but I think there's just discernment around, are you looking for a quick fix? Because we're actually set up to fail. You don't
want to set them up to fail. Like, they're going to try this thing out. If it doesn't work, I'm going to kill myself. Like, you don't want to do that. Right? That would be terrible.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
That makes sense.
So there's that. If there's active psychosis, it can actually deepen that or lead to more of it.
Oh, really?
So yeah.
Is that specific to ketamine? Do you know?
I think it's psychedelics in general. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. That makes sense too.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Personality disorders are an interesting thing. I mean, this is not so much my experience. I'm just more thinking what I've heard from the field. I think that it can be very helpful when there is an enduring negative sense of self. It can provide a break from that really critical inner voice, a sense of like, oh, actually in this moment I can experience myself as beautiful and good and not separate from everything else. Can be super helpful with addiction.
That's great. And that's an interesting one. That's
it's so interesting. I know. And when there are, again, like more extreme kind of fixations or specifically personality disorder, it can be contraindicated. Yeah.
The more extreme kind of situations, probably.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, it's really safe, right? And really.
Generally speaking, it's really safe.
I've heard it can be addictive, but if it's used in the right way, won't lead to addiction.
Right. Yeah. And the forms that I work with mostly are IM intramuscular, which is given in the form of a shot, or lozenges.
Okay.
I think the nasal can be more on the addictive side, is what I've heard.
Because it's easier to get a quicker response.
Yes, exactly. Although IM is pretty quick, but I don't know. I don't actually know why the nasal spray would be. But yeah, in general, it's fairly low risk. The way that I work with it is I'll have clients go see a medical provider who goes through, a pretty comprehensive list to make sure on a biological level it's safe, on a psycho-emotional level it's safe. They write the prescription, and then the client
So
shows
there's
up.
some levels of safety and checking up on things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's good to share that.
Totally.
I think some people are out there are having the idea that in the wild land of Colorado, like things are illegal and you can just do whatever you want. And it's really not like that. And that's not what you're talking about at all. Like
Right.
you're talking about going to your medical provider, a doctor,
Yes.
getting a prescription, working with you as a therapist.
Yes.
And I say that because I get messages and emails from people like, what do you imagine is happening out here? And then we are talking about psychedelic therapy, but it's at this point just limited to ketamine, and I include cannabis in that. That could be one.
Yeah.
But even though psilocybin mushrooms were decriminalized in Denver, it doesn't mean that they're being used in this way we're talking about. And
right.
even though there are trials and studies with MDMA, and it's shown amazing results with, especially with trauma and PTSD, it's not yet reached the stage where it's legal or able to be prescribed.
Right.
I don't know. I just feel inspired all of a sudden to share this little public service announcement.
Yes.
I think there's confusion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll sometimes get inquiries around doing underground work, and I just tell them until it's legal.
Right.
You know, I'm not.
Sorry, it's not. We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. Exactly. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This is great. We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
I didn't expect all this, but it was great.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was a delight to talk with you. So.
Do you have any last thoughts for us? And I'll link your show notes or your website and everything in the show notes so people can see that.
Yeah. I guess just last thoughts might be, I love the blend of Western and Eastern wisdom. Western being that, like, this lens of becoming, or this lens of growth, and this lens of development, right? I can change, I can optimize, I can learn new skills.
Right.
And then the Eastern side of the street being that of being, or this recognition of the fundamental goodness that's already always here.
Yes.
And the recognition of the part of us that's actually beyond needing any sort of repair, beyond being fixed or adulterated, changed in any way.
Yeah.
And that we are both, and both are true, and that they can inform how we show up, because the growth work can be like a hamster wheel, and it can be inspired by this fundamental sense of something's wrong.
Right. That was also on my list of things beforehand to mention that I see that, and I've seen it myself, and I see it here in Boulder and in the personal development space. And in that, it could be a hamster wheel, always trying to fix or improve. And
I think Suzuki Roshi said, "You're perfect as you are, and you could use a bit of work," or something like that. Yeah. And I think
that's a good way to say it.
I think approaching all of
humor can
this,
help.
absolutely, and approaching all of this developmental work from this foundation of recognizing our fundamental goodness, I think is really helpful and important.
So important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.